But first of all, I would like to welcome all of you to this keynote presentation today by Steve Lubkemann. I know it's probably been difficult for many of us to extricate ourselves from the news feed and join another virtual room, which is much more civil than the political sphere. And Steve, I would like to introduce you with great pleasure. It's really, we're very grateful that you could find the time and that you were able to weave your way through various barriers to get to a place where you have connectivity. So thanks very much for joining us here to deliver your lecture on theory in undisciplined practice, anthropologies of change and anthropologists in change. First of all, just a few remarks on Steve's biography, his background, and of course it cannot do justice to the full range of experiences that both academically and activist. So apologies if I omit anything that is key. Steve is Associate Professor of Anthropology and International Affairs at George Washington University. And in addition to that, he wears an impressive number of other hats, I have to say. He is a research associate at the Smithsonian Institution, National Museum of African American History and Culture. And he is the co-founder of the Diaspora Research and Policy Program. And last but not least, he is the founder and co-director of the Slave Wrecks Project. It's an international collaboration active in 8 countries that uses maritime archaeology. And of course, anthropologists these days shouldn't be enthralled by the exotic, but this sounds very exciting to me, I have to admit. As an entry point, using maritime archaeology as an entry point for studying the historical slave trade and engage with the heritage and enduring social legacy of this history. So much of his work, and this should be of interest to the ANTHUSIA members in particular, has focused on displacement, political conflict, social change, and international interventions. That's development, rule of law, and humanitarianism in Africa and the African diaspora. And he has branched out in many different countries. First of all, firmly rooted in long-term research in Mozambique, but also having worked in Angola, South Africa, Liberia, Portugal, and last, the United States as well. His research has been funded by a whole range of funding bodies, and I don't want to spend too much time on that, but he has done impressive research and funded by a whole range of different bodies, both from the more applied side, we might say, in mind of the topic of the talk, and some of the more academic side. Author of numerous articles, I should highlight here a few, co-edited the Perspectives on Africa Reader. The second edition has been published in 2010, the Companion to the Anthropology of Africa, 2018. And he's the co-author of From No Return, the 221-year voyage of the slave ship Sao Jose, that was published in 2016. And of course, his widely acclaimed monograph, Culture and Chaos, an anthropology of the social condition and war, really one of the most important anthropologies of war and crisis and displacement and a whole bunch of other things as well. I should note it was the finalist of the 2009 ASA Herskovits Book Award. And this book is of particular relevance to the themes addressed by ANTHUSIA, the Anthropology of Human Security in Africa, for those who are maybe less familiar with this acronym. And it draws on Stephen's research in Mozambique to develop a fresh perspective on war and displacement when they become the context for normal life, rather than exceptional events disrupting that kind of everyday or the normality, whatever that might be. So without really any further ado, I would like to give the floor to Steve, and then I'll have prepared a few comments after Steve's lecture, and then we'll have a Q&A. Thank you.
So thank you very much. I just want to thank you for the invitation. I would much rather be with you all over there than under these circumstances, and perhaps that will be a possibility in the future. So I'm going to give myself a little bit of a get out of jail free card here in the beginning by just saying, you know, when this was first invitation first came, there seemed to be a vast amount of time in which to unpack and develop a series of ideas that really have been haunting me for some time. Of course, time has creeped up a little faster, and together with COVID, rendered some of those ideas a little less fully cultivated than I would like to have them. What I'm going to offer you today there is best described perhaps as a provocation that's still working its way into an argument. It's still very much adrift in that inner space that where I am actually still arguing with myself. And ensure in some sense of all the ingredients, I'm nevertheless going to bring it out half-baked to you all. And I look forward to hearing back from you, your thoughts and your critiques and insights that can help me refine some of my thinking in this respect, but I will count on your charity as well. So broadly speaking today, I want to reflect with you on the relationship between anthropologists, anthropology, and social change. You may have immediately noticed that in this phrasing, I have separated anthropologists out from anthropology. If you haven't noticed that, please do. And this is quite intentional, indeed central to the argument that I hope to continue thinking my way through here with you today. I'll return to this shortly. So I push this distinction further in the process of considering first the relationship between anthropology as a social practice or profession and social change. More precisely in the sense of discussions about the involvement of the discipline in promoting social change, and even more in redefining the discipline as a form of what we might call political moral agency. The question of how anthropology should define itself in terms of political action is, as many of you know, at the dead center of debates that are fiercely swirling within American anthropologists, current anthropology, the American Anthropological Association, and various web-based initiatives. Indeed, almost any and every scholarly forum in the discipline at this political moment, globally, and in my case, nationally here. So to address how anthropology should redefine itself in terms of its involvement in the project of social change is really to climb up on a rather clouded platform with an enormous amount of already very incisive and passionate thinking. My pretension in climbing onto that stage is to pose what I'm guessing will be taken to be a rather impertinent question. Is this: should those of us anthropologists who are invested in and committed to effecting social change necessarily seek to ground our activism in anthropology? I'd like to pause and query some interrelated notions that apparently seem to be going without saying in the discussions on that stage that I just referred to. The idea that because we are anthropologists, our activism should somehow be grounded in and contained within anthropology. And by extension, therefore, that we need a radical redefinition of the discipline precisely in order to accommodate this activist imperative. The idea that bearing witness to various forms of intersectional forms of domination and inequality, and doing the archaeology of the forms and systems of power that undergird these, will actually provide adequate grounding for the political projects of change that activists may want to carry out. Conversely, I want to ask my own question here: is there any utility in arguing for a different proposition, one that in fact narrows the moral authority and pretensions, activist and social, of the discipline, not in order to eschew the political participation of anthropologists, but paradoxically in order to enable it? Put it another way, my question is about whether the answer to how we ethically confront the very real complex of crises that our world is in, COVID, climate change, authoritarianism, systemic racism, displacement, growing inequality, Donald Trump, is on one hand to transform anthropology into a political practice that is expansive enough to serve as grounds for a form of what we might think of total social engagement. Can it be that expansive? Or perhaps on the other hand, to conceive of the discipline as a far more limited, less authoritative, far humbler, and less socially prescriptive activity? And which of these options may serve the interests of anthropologists in pursuing activism more effectively? I want to make very clear from the get-go that in considering this alternative position of a humbler anthropology, I am not suggesting that anthropologists, or anyone for that matter, should not seek to be critically engaged politically or socially. I am suggesting, however, is that anthropologists and anthropology may be better served when anthropologists recognize the limits of anthropology and treat it as something far more humble, a tool, a method, rather than trying to transform it into the grounds, a form of total social engagement, a religion, a kinship a la Evans Pritchard's Newer, and to recognize instead that the grounding for their very necessary political action lies largely outside of the discipline. Let us be activists yet, but perhaps recognizing that we are better served sometimes by stopping being anthropologists and taking on other roles that we hold as citizens, political agents of various sorts and stripes, willing and able to make good trouble, in the words of the recently passed John Lewis, but without being beholden to or claiming forms of authorization, moral or otherwise, in this discipline. That, I'm going to argue, is actually rather well equipped to provide it. Current remonstrations on the disciplinary stage to the contrary. Throughout this presentation, I'll draw briefly and in piecemeal fashion, very unsatisfactorily for those with thick description sensibilities, on some of my own entanglements and efforts to bring about change, or what I will begin to start referring to in shorthand as activism, to examine in more detail what this activity involves and requires, and to highlight at least some of the reasons why the discipline is, in my view, inadequate grounds for generating and enacting change. On one hand, this has very much to do with the discipline's particular and highly delimited relationship to power, and I will talk about this rather more extensively. A relationship that is observational and deconstructionist while remaining decidedly averse to forms of generative engagement with power. I'm going to suggest that the perspective of the activist, when we think about it, in trying to enact social change, is in final instance all about the restructuring and the deployment of power. It is about, we could use yet another term, engagement in reconfiguration and embracing the task of governance. But I will also argue that anthropology has little to offer as a grounds for the deployment of power, and much less for the purposes that power is deployed in political action in these efforts to effect change. I wanted to explore some of the good reasons for that grounding in the discipline that have to do with the discipline's defining epistemological commitments, and try to explain why I'm entirely unconvinced that the solution is to try to redefine anthropology so that it can more fully address what activists need. I'm going to argue that even if we were seriously to take that idea of expanding anthropology into an activist discipline, that we would quickly find ourselves in a maze of quandaries and paradoxes for which the discipline is not equipped and can find no exit. And I will argue that as an activist, and this is the position in which I speak today, not with my anthropology or archaeology hat on, not with from the position reflected in the CV that was just discussed, but from my experience as an activist, I would like to talk about what I do and do not need from anthropology to serve in order to advance the action that I hope to keep carrying forward. So I will argue that those of us who are activists and happen to be anthropologists will still find some utility in reaching out for our anthropological toolkit, but that toolkit remains more useful to us as activists when the discipline assumes its humbler form. Finally, I'm going to reflect on the fact that the activists' desire for usable tools, for theories that have the potential to not just deconstruct power, but to also deploy it in a generative process of reconstructing alternatives, may actually hold some potential for transforming anthropological theorizing itself. On this second count, I am going to reflect just briefly on my own journey in this respect, and in only one respect, namely in how an interest in effecting social change has excited my interest as an anthropologist in terms of recent anthropological efforts to theorize change in ways that seem to me to also move beyond more limited thinking about change in the discipline to date. And I'll speculate on some of the reasons that that these ideas which resonate with me are found in anthropologies of crisis, of displacement, of pandemic, of disaster. This perhaps may be an example of how an activism by anthropologists that draws upon and has a demand for a usable anthropology, but does not seek moral grounding in the discipline, may potentially be theoretically generative for the discipline itself and of use to those of us who are activists. This is going to be my roadmap. There's a lot of arguing, so let's get going. So first, while I could choose many excellent exemplars of this moment in which the discipline finds itself again, and I do emphasize again, those who are interested in what I may be referring back to may want to visit the debate between Nancy Shepherd Hughes and Roy d'Andrade in the 1920s. But in this moment where the discipline is critically scrutinizing how its objectives and scope of action and ethics as a form of practice should be defined, for brevity's sake, I'm going to schematically reference just one very recent example. Ryan Cecil Jacobson's already much noted and discussed article in the June 2020 volume of American Anthropologists, The Case for Letting Anthropology Burn. To very briefly summarize this, it is in shorthand, a call for the discipline of anthropology to rethink itself as a form of political agent. Abolitionist anthropology as the moral grounding for the task of effecting a particular form of emancipatory social change. So I'd like to suggest that if we are going to consider this possibility for the discipline, perhaps rather than just looking at the discipline, we should take the eyes of the activist and first look at what this thing we call social change actually requires and involves. And then perhaps we can ask whether the discipline is equipped and up to taking on this task. Again, I'm pursuing this reflection today from a particular vantage point, not as an anthropologist, but as an activist. And I've been involved, if not reflected in my CV, on quite a few number of efforts to effect social change. I'll refer to some of these again overly briefly throughout the talk, but in summary, I would refer to, for example, recent efforts around community table, interracial justice and reconciliation, community forum in Virginia, also aimed at addressing some of the most overt aspects of systemic racism. Some of you may be familiar with the Confederate statue issue in the United States. Issues like my work with the Liberian community, the diasporan community on their temporary protective status and then protection for those who have since lost that status since its termination. Restorative justice work, work with that I will refer to somewhat more later with the American Anthropological Association's Ebola Task Force. And then the Slave Rex Project. The Slave Rex Project, I would love to be able to present on that by itself at some point, but it has many dimensions, not just recovering neglected pasts, but of working to decolonize the discipline of maritime archaeology by creating opportunities for the creation of institutions and focusing on training and institutional development in Africa and within the African diaspora, decolonizing museum, and various other different initiatives. Finally, also work with local NGOs in the field of development, and in particular with national NGOs. And I will refer to one initiative that I provided an example of in some of the material circulated earlier. So going back to the article that I referred to, the current debates in which it circulates, I'm going to make a first observation, again, as an activist. It's worth taking note that there's a common thread in this article and in others in terms of what aspects of quote unquote doing change are explicitly being placed on the table and what aspects of doing change receive far shorter shrift. So let me again elaborate from an activist's perspective. Though oversimplified, it's still useful as a starter to think about processes of intentionally effected change as involving at least 4 components or aspects. And again, I'll be glad to provide, I'm sorry, I don't have a presentation, but those who are interested, I'll provide this outline later. The first of those is not unfamiliar to anthropologists, that of critique, roughly being an identification of the structural dynamics and their generative effects that are deemed in need of transformation, i.e., what is it that needs to be dismantled? What needs to be changed from, identified, and diagnosed? This, however, is not all that's involved in the doing of change. In fact, it's a very small first step. You then need to identify a process as an activist for effectively carrying out this dismantling, i.e., for the realization of this aspect of critique. That also is not enough. You have to envision an alternative. What needs to be changed to? And finally, to engage and implement a process of effectively carrying out a generative process through which an alternative structural dynamic with effects is brought into being. The discreteness of these components is really just a heuristic. It's helpful in thinking about different aspects of doing change, but doing change from the perspective of an activist is in fact involves all of these things in any given instance. But observe, much of the doing that is referenced in the calls for a socially engaged and transformative anthropology, in practice, when you look carefully, remains fully ensconced at one end of the continuum of these doings, of these aspects, that of critique. Indeed, the discipline has actually become quite excellent at this, what we might call the deconstructive step of the change process. And be it by drawing from Marx or Foucault or Ahmed, amongst so many others, we have come to excel at diagnosing both the intricate dynamics of systemic forms of power, colonial, neoliberal, gendered, racial, and so forth, and their ramifying and problematic social effects, intersectional inequalities, and so forth, inclusive, not least of all, of their recursive capacity to so often absorb and co-opt critique itself in order to persist. It is interesting that it's precisely exemplars of this deconstructive acumen that Jacobson invokes in his call, following Savannah Shange, who he quotes, for the discipline to move towards an abolitionist anthropology that moves beyond its tendency to, and I quote here, refuse complicity in the structures of dispossession taken up as topics of research, and to insist, and here I paraphrased in order to generalize, that all anthropological work emerges in the wake of historical systems of oppression and therefore must be guided by the necessity of emancipation, first articulated by those who are oppressed or on the losing end of inequality, people themselves. But do any of the exemplars provided in this article or in these debates actually do all of the doing that I have just talked about that an activist recognizes is required to accomplish this change? My answer to that is no, not really. The mission seems to remain largely one in which intervention is observational, focused on doing critique, but rather short on ideas about what comes next. Why is that the case? I think if we reflect a bit further, we begin to understand why that is so. So I want to turn to power and activism. The forms of doing that move beyond critique, any activist recognizes immediately become enmeshed in not merely observing or critically rendering visible the workings of power and domination, or another phrase, bearing witness to critically inhabit the world in a wake of terror, but in actually using and deploying power itself. And I underline this. Social change is involved not in simply observing or deconstructing, but in engaging and using and deploying power itself. Power in this process is transformed through the leveraging, however, of other forms of power. And the power that is leveraged to dismantle the power that is targeted is, interestingly enough, likely in the process itself reinforced. The analogy we can think of, and sometimes I use with my students, is that of an argument. You know, we can argue over the meaning of a term. What does witch hunt, to use something circulating in the American political discourse, mean? And yet in arguing over how to locate that set of ideas vis-a-vis others, in the course of the argument itself, we deploy ideas and terms that are cemented and further reinforced in their own meaning and definition by virtue of not being interrogated, but of being leveraged. So genuine efforts to actually affect social change traffic in power. They deploy power to challenge power. And in the process, as analysts, we have to recognize that they simultaneously and in different ways both undermine hegemony and constitute it. They do both. Both challenge power in one area while they reinforce it implicitly in another. Amman, referred to in Jacobson's article, is thus right, as are the others used as exemplars and invoked there, when they observe that change tends to be driven by a subjunctive politics in which emancipatory alternatives are foreclosed by a more limited range of reforms. But I'm not sure that they are taking this observation quite seriously enough. The doing of change is, in fact, almost always profoundly complicated and profoundly compromised. When you look at the complexities of intersectional forms of power lived in actual contexts and the uncertainties and ambivalencies that characterize a world of complicated collisions and trade-offs, this is the world inhabited by activists, in which activists must and do make choices and commitments about both how and why, and to what ends to deploy power. Calls in the abstract for emancipatory alternatives are perhaps a privilege that those who deconstruct but never reconstruct can afford for themselves. But they provide little in the way of guidance for the activist, for taking any of the next steps in the doing of change. For example, in navigating the commonplace challenge of adjudicating amongst tactics or amongst objectives and values that may never complete or conflict in the abstract, but are encountered as trade-offs in the messiness of activism in the real world. Let me illustrate what I'm saying through my own students here and now, outside the door, on the street. Anthropology, that proclaims itself both advocate of an ethical pandemic citizenship based on following social distancing guidelines and masking, as well as the advocate of the Black Lives Matter protest movement against the outrages of America's persistent racialized structural violence. As long as these remain questions asked in the abstract, divorced from their mutual entanglements in the real world, the prescriptive power of an anthropology with pretensions to an activist identity remains unsullied by contradictions or the need to consider trade-offs. But in the world of the activist, the contradictions that may force themselves into the process of choice may well impose decisions that involve a zero-sum game between commitments that make activism rather messier and thus rather significantly different. So, concretely, I can understand and emphasize with all three of my graduate students who are activists in DC at this moment, despite the fact that they vehemently disagree with each other over whether, case one, the Black Lives Matter street protests held down the street from this office are, to one of them, a sacrificial act in which exposure to COVID is justified for a greater cause. Or alternatively, for the other, these protests are an unnecessarily irresponsible act that places the overriding public health of others at heightened risk. Or to the third, even that these protests represent a tactical error that threatens to undermine its own political objective because of its timing in the American election process, which has allowed it to provide fuel for a need for law and order message that can be used to mobilize at least some voters in the wrong direction. What is it that anthropology pretends to say? Should it pretend to be capable or authorized to say anything about how to adjudicate amongst these three positions in order to exert power, in order to make a choice, in order to choose one over the other? On these questions about not just how to observe power, but about which tactics merit commitment in an effort to dismantle it, in what order, in terms of what hierarchy of priorities, and on what should be erected as an alternative, what, pray tell, does anthropology, its deconstructionist acumen notwithstanding, possibly believe it can or should even weigh in on, and much less with any form of singular or authoritative voice? And who should get to decide? Let me drive more home pointedly two clusters of points, and I will be explicit here. The first, in some sense, I've already rendered explicit, that activism, the effecting of social change, involves deploying power in undoing and reconfiguring power. I often think in terms of my colleague, Harry West, his work, Kupulikula in northern Mozambique, in which he talks about a similar view in which people understand that the power involves both a sorcery of deconstruction or destruction, but also a sorcery of construction. Not just the dismantling or diagnosing and dismantling of power, but the reconfiguring and redeployment of it. Or in other terms, involvement in challenging governance, but not simply challenging, but in reconfiguring and redeploying in alternative forms of governance. So, and in doing so, activism is simultaneously and always both undermining and complicit in forms of established power. Those of you who have seen the movie Doctor Strange may see the critique of the Prime Wizard as a good example, critiqued by one of her followers when it's discovered that she is in fact reaching into the dark side to challenge the dark side. Something similar to this is what happens in real life activism. The second point, which is a corollary of the first, I will make explicit now. Activism involves stepping beyond the recognition of difference to take on and embrace two far more draconian tasks. That of adjudicating amongst competing difference, of committing to the value of some alternatives over others, and of actually laboring to overcome difference in some specified sense. Let me bring this back home to the real world of activism in which I work. It's precisely the overcoming of specific difference that I've come to understand to be at the core of my own efforts to effect social change. Community Table in Front Royal, Virginia, where we deploy this interracial dialogue in an effort to overcome at least some effects of systemic racism, be these interpersonal prejudice, the injustice of our American justice system, or the symbolic violence of white supremacy's pretensions as symbolically represented in statuary and elsewhere. In the campaign to prolong and later address the plight of former Liberian TPS holders, we seek to overcome a difference, to change, to exert new forms of governance, or to invert in some way the relationship of authority between international and national NGOs is to overcome a difference, to exert power, to reconfigure and engage in a new task of governance. Let me keep this activist hat on for a moment and ask, is anthropology well equipped to these tasks? It seems to me that almost immediately we run into the rub, so to speak, for anthropology when we think about how anthropology does what it already does and needs to continue to be able to do. At its core and across its various theoretical dispensations, the distinctive possibilities of knowing that anthropology has offered has rested, indeed relied indispensably upon a posture towards difference that I will argue is fundamentally antithetical to the posture of the activist or change agent. Anthropology knows as it knows, and I value this through its core methodological commitments that insist on suspending, on refusing any adjudication amongst difference and deploying instead a form of radical empathy in order to understand it. Or put in other words, if anthropological forms of intelligibility are generated through and because of its commitments to not deploy power in order to overcome difference, and we could add here, in longer elaboration, I might even say surrender to difference. If we come, and we also come to understand that social change involves what I've described, stepping beyond critical diagnosis of difference to deploy and reconfigure power in order precisely to adjudicate amongst and eventually overcome certain specified differences. And if we come to understand that, again, the defining contribution of anthropology inherently has relied upon a refusal to do such adjudication, then we're left with a contradiction. It can only be resolved with a choice between two different things that anthropology can be. It probably cannot be both. In an argument I don't have space to elaborate on here, I would extend this and note that that choice is largely probably an illusion, since one of these would in fact, by necessity, dissolve anthropology altogether. With more time, I would also note that the discipline is still unlikely to give up on its pretenses to become the moral grounding for anthropologists who are activists, and that arguments to that effect tend to rely on certain forms of selectivity and abstraction that are themselves merit critique. I will simply say that those of us who are in fact activists should remain watchful and wary of these disciplinary pretenses and the prescriptive pronouncements about change that come from those whose actual familiarity is confined to but a narrow slice of what doing change requires. On that last point, let me elaborate and demonstrate how anthropology is particularly ill-equipped to the task of adjudicating difference in tactics that are so crucial and have to be chosen among in an activist's world of doing of change. In the preparations for this seminar, I was asked to circulate some reading material. One thing I sent around was a concept note for a collaboration envisioned among local NGOs and colleagues with which I have collaborated in 3 locations, Liberia, Mozambique, and Angola. The idea behind this project is to invert some forms of authority in international development work by creating programs that require international development experts to actually become minimally versed in some of the most relevant aspects of both the local context that they are parachuting in to operate in and the trajectory of outcomes of past intervention efforts in their areas of action, rule of law, public health. In the process, placing national NGOs in the driver's seat and on the delivery end of an education process or of capacity building process, and the internationals on the receiving end of the same. If you read through this carefully enough at some point, you'll see that it not only takes note of, but actually seeks to leverage certain aspects of the development enterprise, even as it is challenging the ones I just mentioned. What does it leverage? Things like careerist ambition in order to create a web of incentives that might line up a variety of interests with various forms of power to enable the realization of these aspects of the proposition that are radical, that are to be changed. But radical? Well, yes, in a certain sense of some of the specific inversions and questions, undoubtedly so, but in many, many other senses and from some other perspectives, decidedly not radical. Aman and the other exemplars in the Jacobson article are undoubtedly right. Much of the overall architecture of development itself, this is a subject I teach here at George Washington University from a decidedly critical perspective, is not only not challenged by this project, but certain facets of it are actually leveraged and thus presumably reinforced in an effort to bring about some specific changes. And what does anthropology have to say about the moral grounding of this particular political project, this doing of change? You tell me. My guess is that some of you are breaking one way and see merit in pursuing its specific change objectives. Others of you are channeling Aman and decrying its potential to be co-opted into the neo-colonial enterprise that development is, in so many ways, certainly is. But you will not speak with any singular voice. And mind you, even if you did, I'm rather sure that as an activist whose own complex reckoning with this conundrum is grounded in a far vaster range of experiences than merely those my profession as an anthropologist has afforded to me, I doubt that I would defer to you, at least in as much and merely because you are anthropologists. In an exactly similar vein, we could speak of every single other ongoing entanglement to effect change that I am actively engaged in the task of deploying power with the objective of overcoming some specified difference. I will refer to simply 2 of these. The Decolonizing the Museum initiative within the Slave Rex Project, which aims and works with various different local museums to help them reconfigure, for example, the Maritime Museum in Mozambique Island, which at the moment stands exactly as it did at the end of the colonial era, as a monument to the Portuguese Navy, in order to tell entirely different stories from an entirely different perspective, that of a Mozambican perspective. Now, some will note that forms of that the power are undermined here, and others will ask if indeed others are problematically reinforced. Those of you familiar or who work in the field of museum studies know that the very notion of museum to some would render the title of the Decolonizing Museum Initiative an oxymoron. Similarly so with other initiatives in the Slave Rex Project, such as the Maritime Archaeology of the Slave Trade Diversity Initiative, that started with a recognition that not a single African American and no Black African maritime archaeologists existed or had been trained a decade ago. This initiative focuses predominantly on increasing the participation, on professionalizing, on bringing people into the profession, and on creating institutions in which they can carry this, this profession out within the African context that are sustainable and in ways that allow them to dictate their agenda. But in this training, issues come up. What is the better, certainly some of the ways in which maritime archaeology, I don't have time to sort of go into this, is rendered in the canon, reflect its emergence very much so within particular racial boundaries, within particular colonial, highly colonial and nationalist frameworks. And yet, is it important in this training for them to, for those we train to be able to master the canon in order to be accepted as legitimate and then be able to critique it? Or should we simply issue that canon altogether? In all of these, there are multiple possible answers, grounded in reasonable, if competing politics and commitments, and even notions of what emancipatory is, or how is, should be, or how to get there. Anthropology, I will suggest, has nothing. It has nothing in its toolkit with which to engage in this task of adjudication, of addressing the commonplace activist challenge of adjudicating amongst tactics or amongst objectives and values that may never compete or conflict in the abstract, but are encountered as trade-offs in the messiness of activism in the real world. There are, for me, no viable grounds that I can discern for any activist to entrust this task to the discipline. So where are we now? Having told you as an activist that I do not need, nor do I want, and let me, what I do not need or what I do not want from anthropology, let me finish and spend a few minutes taking note of what, as an activist, I do want from anthropology, and what those needs may do for an anthropology that is pressed to respond to it by its activists, who also happen to be, by the way, anthropologists. As an activist, I do want from anthropology, and can use, the insights that a humbler anthropology, delimited by its fidelity to knowing by not exerting power to overcome difference, in some sense by not trying to effect change when confronted with difference, can produce. This is a vital capacity to render difference, if not necessarily, quote unquote, in its own terms, certainly in terms that still insist on not being collapsed into my own, and that to some, and in some sense, more closely mirror the agency of subjects. Many different examples I can think of, but Harry West's work on democracy tells us what it is that democracy is as an actual experience on the ground in northern Mozambique. It has nothing to do with the charter myths that might be carried into an enterprise such as democratization initiatives taking place in that carry carry the model of the charter myths of democracy, the failure of those charter myths in the places that generate them, notwithstanding, and that is somewhat ironic and definitely applicable here in the place where I stand today. But this is a particularly vital task, a vital thing that for those activists who are seeking to overcome in order to understand what differences to target and what differences, in fact, and what they should be trying to do. I want this kind of insight desperately as an activist into white supremacists, into the militia in Front Royal that are mustering and have been mustering for the last few days in the face of the possible electoral failure of Donald Trump. The anthropological insights that can tell me why they tick and what they do are vital in order for me not to work with them, but to seek, in fact, to overcome that which they represent. I would note a paradox, and I don't have time to untangle this here, but that a delimited and humbler anthropology without activist pretenses may, in fact, be more useful to the task of the real world activists. We may be able to use it more effectively. What else do I want as an activist from anthropology? Usable theory. Theory of a sort that an anthropology that is largely divorced from the bulk of what is involved in doing social change, that identifies levers, those who are doing social change wants to identify levers through which power can be generatively deployed, has in rather short supply at the moment. So I don't have, I want to suggest that, and I don't have time to spell this out fully, but that that a rather different kind of theory is rendered, or a different kind of theory work is rendered, when the questions that are asked by people who have not just an interest in the subjects they study, but an interest in how studying those subjects can produce models for their own action. When I first thought of this presentation, I wanted to reflect in particular and spend most of my time on recent anthropological theorizations of change. This would have been grounded in an extended overview of the discipline's theoretical approaches to social change, including a critique of much of what has passed as theory of change since the discipline's historical turn, but that it will have to wait for a further or a different time for a full elaboration. But I still want to make brief reference to what in the discipline excites me at the moment as an activist about theories of social change, about this particular set of ideas that are emerging and to me seem increasingly not just capable of revealing realities elsewhere, but of helping me think about I can go about engendering and producing change myself. It's not surprising perhaps that the question of change is a central one, in a sense a forced one, upon anthropologists who work in contexts of crisis and its social navigation. This is a primary line for much of my own anthropological work. And I think that it's likely that crisis serves as such a productive site for theorizing social change in ways that speak to activists' imperatives, and I'll get to this in a moment, in part because the conditions of crisis, in fact, forcibly place those we study or encounter in these places in a very similar position to that of the activists, one in which they are required to effect social change because of rapid and consequential transformations in many dimensions of their own opportunity structures. How, for example, can you still fulfill prescriptions of being a mother, of being a daughter-in-law, and of being a spouse, if in fact the spatial forms that enable you to enact the prescriptive relationships have been changed by displacement that has dispersed this network, and you are faced with being one or the other? Or how, in fact, can you fulfill prescribed fertility life projects that are premised on the idea of certain level of contact with a spouse, when all of a sudden displacement changes the possibilities and a spouse is gone for an entire for a woman's entire fertility lifespan. These are problems that require, in fact, an activist's mind. You can't stand still. You have to, in fact, engage, not just diagnose, but engage in the reconfiguration of power. There's no choice but to make new choices, to adjudicate amongst difference, and to exert power in changed fields of power in order to overcome difference. Sorceries of construction, in Harry West's term, are a requisite for the social navigators of crisis contexts, and thus they are for their ethnographers too. And here, perhaps, the ethnography and the theory that is produced may be of interest to activists. A strategic research site for considering the question that I posed at the end of Culture and Chaos and take up in the article that was distributed, at least descriptively, the Where to Be an Ancestor article. And this is the question: how is it that certain novel propositions emerge in the first place? How do some come to gain social traction and authorization while others, frankly, do not? My own efforts, I don't have, again, the time to spell this fully out, But the answer to this question, the theories that are produced in engaging with these questions, the work of theory building is rendered different when this question is not merely one that is aimed at trying to understand the realities in Machaz or in Mozambique, but is also a self-interested one. When the answers sought are not just how they play it out about how these dynamics or how this works elsewhere, but in trying to use analysis of that elsewhere to think more broadly about how that might work more generally, but in fact about how social propositions emerge, gain social traction or fail here. Why? Because that is a question that an activist is always asking. This sensibility produces a certain form of place and metric from which to read and assess the results of theorizing efforts, not least of all one's own. And in thinking about this, the article and my own work on this, my own work has certainly tried to complicate our understandings of the grounds of power and its exercises and processes of what I would call social argumentation. To me, some of those results, judged as an activist, as somebody self-interested in this theory, not just what it can say for Machaz, but how it can help me think about the work that I do, is satisfactory in some ways. For those of you who have read the article or who may read the work elsewhere, in particular, the critique it makes of previous notions of how culture works, not those of people like Thayer and Scudder, or of people like Nordstrom, and the introduction of notions that begin to look at culture as a resource for, first and foremost, exerting creativity. Also, somewhat satisfactory and helpful for my own thinking, nuancing the basis of authorization, in particular, what is the basis for authority? And I have a discussion there of things such as moral capital and how it is that those can come into play and play a role in all of a sudden challenging something that seems like a fundamental, quote unquote, cultural prescription that you must return home to the ancestors, and inverts it and allows somebody's, not everybody's, but somebody's, and explains why some of those somebodies can in fact propose the opposite, that in fact now the ancestors have come here, inverting this and asking a different question, where to be an answer. But at the same time, this sensibility as an activist looking for usable theory in the work I do elsewhere leaves me and has left me decidedly unsatisfied with my own formulations elsewhere. What has remained in this black box and not explained? Those of you who may read the article or who may read this discussion in the book will see a reference to the importance of certain forms of epistemic power, rendered also as plausibility, the sensibility, the arguability of a new proposition. And yet, really explaining that, I may have flagged it, but left it in a black box. This, however, as an activist, is something that still haunts me and haunts my search for theories of social change, more so, I will be frank, than the situation in Machaz itself. Flash forward to others who, to me, offer some compelling ways to unpack that black box and think about what goes into effective introduction to change and resistance to it, precisely what renders something, quote unquote, plausible, sensible, arguable, what untangles the power of hegemony and pushes something into the realm of ideology. I don't have much time to go into Paul Richards' work, 2014 on the Ebola crisis and reactions to it, but I encourage all of you to consult it. His approach to techniques of the body and how it is and his analysis of the ingredients that contribute to behavioral commitment, a tendency to resist changes in the techniques of the body, is fascinating and applicable. Ingredient one, the behavior effectively addresses a technical issue, to eat, to dispose of the body. Ingredient two, the behavior is also effective in accomplishing social work, We know that a dinner date, at least in the US, is not just about eating enough calories, but it's about creating a certain type of socially valued bond in a culturally specific way, and so with a funeral in Sierra Leone. And then ingredient 3, the behavior generates a positive emotion. And here, Richards invokes notions, draws on ideas about ritual that in innovative ways that help us better understand how it is that people become emotionally tethered, and to understand what is required for acceptance of something that is to replace a ritual. A ritual requires another ritual. It is insufficient to simply address the previous 2 social or technical tasks. When coupled with some of the ideas that I had laid out previously in Culture and Chaos, about how the process through which social power is exercised, to me, all of a sudden a light bulb goes on, and I see actionable ways of thinking about effecting change. I see an advance in theory that I can use, to happen to overcome resistance to the forms of governance that I, as an activist, seek to see implanted in the world. This has become a way, this is a particular, as a particular sensibility to theory, again, produces a different metric from which to read and assess theorizing efforts. And I wonder what it does potentially for anthropology itself. Certainly, I know that it is compelling to the students that I teach. I circulated amongst you prior to the seminar an exercise I have now run twice with my students since March called Thinking with Africa, using Ebola to improve responses to COVID. And it has been amazing how those students have been able to take some of these precepts to think about the world in which they live and how to act on it in ways that reflect effective pandemic citizenship. I don't have time here, and in a further elaboration, I would talk a little bit about how very different such actionable theories of change look from other treatments, regardless of their descriptive excellence, that prevail in the field and that pass as theories for change. This will have to wait for a more fully fleshed out comparison and discussion. For now, I'll just end with the observation that perhaps we have an example of what an activism that is grounded outside of anthropology, when pursued by anthropologists who bring the concerns of that activism back into their disciplinary thinking, might also do for the discipline. Let me conclude. Here in America, it is in a certain way a very dark, dark hour, notwithstanding the hope that many of us have for the electoral results that may, in fact, come to be at the end of this very day. But we should not forget how narrow this margin is and what that signifies. Nowhere is this more evident in the US of this week. In the places that I will travel to after I finish this lecture later today, where in fact, people are organizing things such as militias. Activism is needed and is called for more than ever before. Let's by all means engage, but let's consider carefully how exactly anthropology can be most effectively harnessed to this task. Whether this is about redefining anthropology as activism, or about knowing when those of us who are anthropologists should step outside of the discipline, and when as activists we can rate it to good effect in the full range of doings that the complicated and complex doing of social change requires. Thank you.
Steve, thanks very much indeed. This was a provocation, albeit a humble one. So very, really very much here to engage with and to think through. I'll just kick off with a few remarks highlighting, I think, what were key points, and then we can move over to the question and answer session. I think you're reminded that we might be better served both as anthropologists and citizens or activists by differentiating the identity as anthropologist, anthropology as academic discipline, and finally, activism and public engagement is very welcome and offers a fresh perspective on debates both within and beyond the academy. Your case for a humbler anthropology, I think, is important, and at least as far as I'm concerned, for whatever that might be worth, I think it goes back to the fundamentals of what anthropology is about. Anthropology, as you also highlight, is about suspending judgment, not judging the people we work with. There's a sense of an intellectual curiosity to learn about other ways of life rather than trying to sort of stay within my own bubble, like to get out of the comfort zone, wherever you're coming from. So I think it is really an important case that you make to be humble and to go back to like sort of the fundamentals of what anthropology is about. I think it could prove controversial. It somehow, I think it could kind of run counter to and I'll come to that in a moment. It could run counter to certain trends maybe. So I'll come to that in a moment. So I think the humble anthropology is something which is something that we should really engage with and interrogate as well, of course. In terms of interrogation of humble anthropology, let me ask, well, it's not a question really. So it's a point I would like to raise. It emphasizes, I think, a key point. You could respond to it, or we can move to the Q&A. So it's really up to you and up to Lotte, who is monitoring our exchange as well. Now, taking your view on social propositions gaining social traction, what do you think, realistically, is the potential of humble anthropology to gain social traction and authorization in anthropology? So that would be like the first point. Because playing the devil's advocate, it could be seen as maybe harking back to a more conventional, compartmentalized knowledge production, something that you would find in the AAA Statement on Human Rights, 1947. You know, as anthropologists, we cannot say anything about other people's moralities. So is there something there that could be critical? And well, if it harks back to that, is that a problem? That brings me to the second point about the understanding of the academic discipline. In your talk, you refer to anthropology in the singular. I assume it's the academic discipline, but do we even have that coherent academic discipline? Just thinking of the fragmentation of the academic disciplines generally, you know, that basically in one neck of the woods of a discipline, you barely understand what they're talking about in the other neck of the woods. That's really different from, like, you know, Evans Pritchard's times and other times. And that brings me to the second point of, can we really speak of one anthropology? Is that there are very different national traditions. There is a German tradition of anthropology or Volkskunde, you know, there are Scandinavian, there's the British social anthropology, there's the Portuguese anthropology, there's Global South, Brazil anthropology, South Africa. So anyway, you're seeing what I'm getting at. So is there even such a thing as anthropology anymore that could be seen as that? So that brings me to the third point that I found really worth highlighting, and that's the social change. And I wonder, probably we don't have time for that, but whether you could expand on that notion of social change and link it to the differentiation between being an activist and being an anthropologist and being in academia. Because one thing about social change, there seems to be an assumption there that we all know and approve of a certain notion of social change, but social change, ontologically maybe, could mean very different, or could be different things for different people. You know, you mentioned the militias forming outside. For them, social change is a very different thing. And I do wonder whether maybe anthropology, some quarters of it have become very insular. So mainly talking to each other, you know, and then we all know what social change is and we agree that it's a good thing. But somehow then if we meet someone others notions of social change that, you know, then we think, no, that's not a good social note. That's bad. So I wonder whether there's something there that you would like to expand on, that notion and conceptualization of social change. And maybe just let me finish on that note, is that anthropology, as you also highlighted, is an excellent discipline to study social change. Now, if we take together suspension of moral judgment and studying social change, should we then not therefore maybe, as you say, be more humble, take a step back, rather than basically, how should I say, frame the academic enterprise in terms of an activism? I could see, and I think you also see that as also actually that could be problematic also in terms of power relations within American anthropology. So anyway, so these are just a few remarks sort of off the cuff that I had because it was a really stimulating talk. You have so many things that you raised. So these were three that I found really striking.
So let me answer those quickly, but to start to answer those, because I think all of those merit, coffee or beer and a long discussion that unfortunately we won't be able to have.
It could be maybe in years to come.
I mean, we will, yes, but certainly, the question, yes, in some sense, I am thinking about this as an academic discipline. And of course, I'm going to be more shaped by the milieu I'm in, which is, American anthropology. That said, I think that some of these discussions, at least, from my familiarity with colleagues in South Africa, in Portugal, in the UK, and so forth, seem to have their own variations, right? I mean, some of this discussion is not, is not uniquely isolated to the United States. I think so. That's a fragmentation of the academics, but of course, then it's fragmented in terms of other ways to apply it and so forth. I think all of those simply, my argument would be that they amplify the some of the points that I've actually tried to make about the incapacity of the discipline, in some sense, to speak with a voice, to adjudicate amongst, to take up what actually is involved, right, in being in some sense a political project. I absolutely agree with you. I mean, and I have a caveat in there that I don't think this is going to change. That there are certain pretensions to an activist impulse or redefining that are not going to go away. And I understand that. If you were to ask me what, if I were to draw on sort of my own evolving thinking about, as an anthropologist, theories of social change, what is potentially different about this is, or that might have some appeal in the argument, is that I am not arguing that I'm not, in fact, arguing that anthropologists should not be involved as activists. I'm in fact arguing that activists can be better served, in fact, by an anthropology that is humbler. That, I think, is a different argument that it is an argument that I think resonates pretty quickly with those who are activists, but is not one that necessarily circulates sort of in the high echelons of amongst those who are discussing the idea of activist anthropology, because I don't know to the extent to which they actually are involved in activism, and that may be an unfair critique. So, if I were to take one idea that maybe comes out of left field or has a possibility of a flanking maneuver in this discussion, it might be that. But I think the other thing I would point out, and I didn't have time to discuss this, but I would probably do a detailed analysis of this. I think we could ask a question why this question perennially comes back in the field every 20 years or 25 years, and yet somehow doesn't necessarily seem to do what it sets out to do, by looking at cases in which anthropologists have in fact tried to become an activist enterprise. And one of those that in which I was very deeply involved in was the American Anthropological Association's Ebola Response Task Force. And I don't have time to sort of do a deep analysis here, but I think that the utter failure of that initiative in some respects to get away from sort of this either or dynamic reveals an enormous amount of that, that speaks to exactly what I'm trying to get at here. I think this question that you ask, it's interesting, your first question about, whether this would be seen as a sort of reverting back to ideas of, what is a humbler anthropology? I think you later come and talk about this question of social change and how it is that it gets represented in this sort of this movement to move towards a redefining activist anthropology. I think you're pointing to the fact that in fact those arguments often rest upon a certain highly selective choice of cases, and this is something we could discuss at sort of much greater length. It's very easy, take any of the cases in Jacobson's article or all of these, it is easy to argue for an activist anthropology when the political alignments, which I would say there is certainly a grain within the discipline in American, at least in the American case, and probably writ large, right, align very nicely with those subjects. What does that mean, however, if you are in fact trying on studying white supremacists? Much more problematic, and so it raises a whole series of other questions that are conveniently sort of lost in this argument, right? As of course, this I think one of the things I really hope to bring to bear is I think that it's not just that anthropologists, when they really get down to it, don't necessarily agree on what the social change should be and what is the valid social change, but even when they do agree on it, may have entirely different notions of what should be prioritized and what in fact should, what the tactics should be. Is the Slave Rights Project decolonizing the museum? Well, yes, at one level, but to some, at another level where, I guess we are reinforcing it. That, are we challenging international development? So I think one of the fundamental things that is missing in the arguments within anthropology is a careful critical analysis of what exactly social change is involved. And this is one of the things I try to really bring out is it's not just diagnosing, it's not just critiquing, it is actually exerting, it is engaging in governance. And anthropologists, of course, immediately will take a step back because, again, our impulse, our epistemology is one that learns by not doing that in some sense. But on the other hand, that involves a choice. That involves real choices. What is it that we have epistemologically that allows us to address those? I'm not sure. We can pretend we do if we're selective about the cases and they line up nicely and we all agree about those cases to an extent.
Thanks, Steve. I've just been alerted to a large number of questions that are now in the queue. So I don't want to cut you off because you will have ample time to respond. So thanks very much for that reaction. And let's hand over to, I think, Lotte, who is handling the Q&A.
Yeah, thank you so much, Steve. So the first question we have is from Ayo. Ayo, are you there with us? We could see you.
Yes, I think I'm unmuted now. Yes, thank you for a very inspiring talk. I think it's a very needed subject to talk about. My question relates to the relation between practice, activism, and anthropology. In your opinion, what are the most important skills that we as anthropologists bring to the table in the design of projects that aim at social change, in practice? So my point of departure is that I'm currently doing an applied anthropological PhD on humanitarian aid, which actually leads to real recommendations. At the same time, I find so much of the anthropological literature on humanitarian aid very disencouraging because so much of it wants to really denounce humanitarian practice altogether. So that's the dilemma I'm in right now. So I found your talk really inspiring. So yeah, if you can answer that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question. And, you know, I worked for several years with the Humanitarianism and War Project. So it's one that you know, resonates in many different ways. And I recognize exactly where you stand, even without going into the specifics. You know, I would say this. I think that, you know, I guess my first question would be about sort of the framework of applied, and sometimes that means that sort of the you know, the questions are already predefined and the parameters are predefined, you know, often by something like a funder or somebody who's already set what the problem is. And I think one of the things that I've really tried to do in my activism is place myself in a position in which I'm able to formulate the questions themselves, right? So that's just kind of one thing that I would sort of distinguish, that I think makes sort of the approach that I'm talking about different from applied as I know it in the States. Now, so applicable but not applied. But having said that, once you are I mean, in a sense, you are engaging with a question as an activist, right? And that question is going to, in some sense, it will inevitably, if you are trying to bring about change, I'm going to suggest that that's not really an anthropologically, it's not a great anthropological question. It's a great activist question. Now, the question is, what can you use from anthropology to ask it or to address it? That's a different way of thinking about this, right? To not to necessarily contain it within anthropology, but to in fact contain it with sort of, or to put the container around it as an activist, and then think, okay, what is it that anthropology can bring to bear on this, right? And I think that I don't, you know, how is it? Again, the anthropologists that you're talking to, and I could probably list most of them right immediately. Including those a couple down the hall from me here, although not right at the moment, sit very much in that vein of the initial part of doing, right? This part of critique. And yet that's not what you're trying to do, right? You're not simply trying to observe power, right? You're trying to reconfigure power. You're trying to deploy with it in a generative way. And that's what an activist does. You know, the interesting thing is, to me, the discipline has somehow mistaken the idea of critique as activism, or as somehow, you know, the doing of change. Well, no, it's not, right? And if you were an activist, or you would know that. But you know, we haven't problematized this question of what social change actually is. You know, and simply sort of hunkered down in the side of critique, you know, and then what is the assumption? It happens by osmosis. So this is kind of a roundabout way of thinking about it. But, you know, I mean, I would say if you're trying to transform something, that's an activist question. Now, certainly you can draw on anthropology in the ways I was alluding to at the end, I think, in order to do that. But I think that your enterprise is that of an activist, strangely enough.
Thank you so much, Steve, and also to Io. So we have many questions lined up and not very much time left. So can I suggest that I read one question for you, Steve?
Sure.
And then if we can get Ruth ready to ask her question live, Tom?
And I would add, I've gone over, if people have questions and you want to at some point send them, I would be more than glad to try to address those post facto to some extent.
We are also collecting them and sending them to you. But here's a question from Tanya from the ANTHUSIA project, the Oslo hub. He writes, thank you for an interesting talk. You started out by sketching a context of crisis to ground your call for doing change. I was reminded of the work of Janet Reutemann, the Anti-Crisis book from 2014. who looks at crisis as a post hoc statement that foregrounds certain questions, but precludes others. In relation to this, could you perhaps speak a bit more to why it is that anthropologists have repeatedly diagnosed their own discipline as in crisis? What this means in relation to critique as the cognate of crisis, but perhaps also what this means in relation to complicity. What is it that we as anthropologists would be complicit in if we do not do change or do not move beyond critique? And what are we perhaps not seeing or obscuring from you precisely by framing our discipline as being in crisis? So that's the question
Sure.
from Tanya. And I wonder if we could also bring on Ruth's question, or maybe while Tom does that, Ruth Prince, then you can answer this one, Sue.
Okay. So you would, I think, I mean, that is a fascinating question, and one which I think sort of brings Janet Reutmann's notions back to reflect on the discipline in particularly interesting ways. And I think, you know, one of the things I've learned over time is when I encounter something like that, that makes me want to think about it, I should probably think about it before I try to answer it. So I'd like to see that question written out and give it some more thought. But I think actually, even in the way it was posed, there are some interesting suggestions, and I'd be interested in hearing her suggestions about this. Right? I mean, there's some lead in there that is fascinating to me.
That's fine, Steve. You can be in a conversation with Tanya about it. But should we just? I can see Ruth is on.
Go ahead.
So maybe we can let Ruth ask her questions, and then we will have to round up.
Hi, thanks for this really, really interesting, really important talk. I found it very fascinating. And actually, you know, you've actually been discussing some of the questions I had, which is really about critique and the role of critique, and it's something that I've been thinking about a lot, and of course, the anthropologists, the limitations of critique and the limitations of anthropology, which is, or after all, a discipline of critique and of scholarship. And I think this comes really also from many of the students, you know, students of anthropology these days who are somehow not satisfied with the intellectual pleasures that come from deconstruction or exposition or revelation, and feel you know, that they need to do something more with what they're learning and engaging with, and I think, you know, what you're telling us is that it's not, you know, there's no answer. It's a kind of messy and possibly, you know, also dangerous, not dangerous, but, you know, a messy and unclear arena, and perhaps it's that actually is important to just engage with that, and instead of you know, I think that we yeah. So anyways, my question was to you about what do you think the role of critique is now for anthropology? That's my question.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. You know, I don't want to dismiss critique, right? I think critique is important, but I do want to but I want us to understand that critique is not the same as doing social change, right? It is a step, but a minor step, and there are other things that have to happen if you're to do this. I share the frustration that you've mentioned with that students have, and I think that is within a discipline writ large, right? Like, okay, critique. Well, let's go beyond this. If you read this this article by Jacobson, an abolitionist anthropology, is in fact, interestingly enough, arguing for more than that, but not really thinking through, in my view, what that actually is, right? Yeah, and how you go about doing it. the questions that an actual activist would ask. So the response, let me be very simple here. I think the response of the discipline in the United States and maybe elsewhere is an interesting one, which is, okay, let's expand anthropology to include, to become this. Can we do that, right? And I'm suggesting it's problematic. I think there's a different way to think about it, which is anthropology doesn't have, if I want to be an activist, let me be an activist, right? But rather than expanding, anthropology, it's interesting how much anthropologists, in some sense, think that anthropology should be sort of this total social fact, should be what kinship is, as Evans Pritchard speaks about it with the newer, sort of relevant to everything. But there's a different way to think about that, right? I can take an anthropology, I can shrink it and put it as a small element within the diagram of the Venn diagram of my whole life. And my activism, so I'm not arguing against activism. I'm saying by all means, be activists, and explore the connections between the two, but maybe activism is more possible and more viable, and the relationship between activism and anthropology is a better one if you aren't seeking to contain the activism within and as a way of defining the anthropology itself, but you are pursuing it in another role, right? As something else, and then seeking ways in which to draw upon what you do as an anthropologist as well, but not trying to make it all fit within anthropology.
Yeah, thanks. I'll give the word to Gerhard. And just say that we have more questions, but I'm just going to collect them and send them to you because we're being kicked out of this in 10 minutes.
Yeah, just let me reiterate. Thanks, Steve. Fantastic, great engagement, and you could see by the questions that were raised, and unfortunately we didn't get around to all the other questions. But as you said, I mean, if you can respond to them in due course. I mean, your involvement with ANTHUSIA will not end today, so we will draw on your wisdom. And on that note, I really would like to thank you once again, and also thank, of course, Aarhus for putting the whole summer school together. Lotte and her team, a fantastic job as well. So, and thanks to all the early stage researchers, as we call them in our parlance, the PhD students. Your contribution is fantastic as well, and all the other guests as well. So I want to thank all of you and bid you a good evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Steve, and see most of you tomorrow.